Okay. Thank you, Stephen. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Annette Lieba, and I am the Technical Services Division Administrator for the Oregon Water Resources. I don't know what happened. Hello. Okay. I want to introduce the team that is going to be working on our evening events tonight. So Justin Iverson is the groundwater section manager for the Oregon Water Resources Department, and Laura Hart is the rules coordinator for this project and will be serving as the hearings officer. Additionally, anybody who's got a blue tag on is also a Water Resources Department employee. So if you need anything, feel free to grab one of them, with the exception of Mr. Tripp. So I want to start just by kind of going over how we're going to approach the evening. This meeting is being recorded, as will the official public hearing. This informational session is not part of. Should I try again? All right. And for the informational session, we have a presentation, roughly 35 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. We'd like to ask you to please hold your questions until the end. If there are more questions than we have time to answer, you may submit your question in writing, and we will summarize those questions along with the answers and put them on our website shortly after this meeting. We have some index cards. Some of them are out front. Emily also has some. So if you need an index card to write down your question to make sure that you remember it, feel free to grab one. And for people who had questions that we didn't get to before we adjourn the informational at 6:30, we will collect those cards. Let's see. One other thing I want to make sure that we focus on is that when you ask the question, you need to wait for me to bring you the microphone, since this is being recorded. If you're not speaking into the microphone, it will not be recorded. And also, if your question sounds like a comment, we'll probably encourage you to make sure to sign up to testify as well. And again, we'll conclude the informational session promptly at 6:30. And then we'll start the public hearing at 7. To testify during the public hearing, please sign out up front. Bathrooms are out here along with drinking fountains. So with that, thank you for coming. We really appreciate your interest in this very important issue for Oregon. And I am going to turn it over to Justin.
Yeah, that's what it was just.
Does anybody have a red truck whose alarm might be going off? Okay, thank you.
It's off, I think. It's off now, sir. It's off. Stopped.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Again, I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section at the Water Resources Department, based out of Salem. Again, as Annette mentioned, this first. That's still going. Okay, there we go. Purpose of the first hour here is to we're going to take the first half roughly and provide some background information, hopefully give everybody a common foundation to work from. Happy to answer any questions folks have. And again, if you have comments, then please hold on to those and put them in the public record starting at 7. So again, going to take about half an hour for this informational session. Going to give a brief introduction to groundwater development and how groundwater works real broadly. We'll talk about some signs of overappropriation and the issues that causes around Oregon. Give an overview of the rulemaking. I'll spend a good chunk of time on 2 of the most substantial components of the proposed rules, the implications of those and the expected benefits. And from there, happy to answer folks' questions that might come up as we go. So first of all, in our introduction, always have been starting out these informational sessions with a picture of the water cycle, because I want to emphasize that groundwater, which is what we're focused on for this rulemaking, just the groundwater component, is a flowing component of the water cycle. So precipitation, snow melt infiltrates into the ground through deep percolation. That happens relatively continuously through time. That continuous input drives flow through that groundwater system, and that flow is going someplace. And generally in Oregon, where that's going is to discharge near to the bottomlands as springs or stream flow. And so we call this interaction or this interface hydraulic connection. So for the purposes of rulemaking, when I talk about hydraulic connection, that's the place I'm talking about. Now, if we develop groundwater and install a well, we are dominantly in most places in Oregon pulling water out of this flowing pathway. And that has implications not just for the groundwater system, but it kind of makes a new pathway in the hydrologic cycle and kind of short circuits that flow. So to look at this again, got a picture of a spring on the Metolius River. And if you can imagine installing a well, just upgrading that stream, hopefully it's intuitive that when you pump water out of that well, you're going to reduce the spring flow by the same amount. You can push that well further back up the slope, and you can extend the timing and reverse the impact. But given enough time, all the water that you pump out of that well is going to be water that doesn't come out of that spring. And that's a cumulative set of impacts. So many wells, then the cumulative pumping rate is going to result in that much reduction in the spring. And install wells we have. So this plot shows development of water wells from 1955, the time of the Groundwater Act, when we started requiring well log records, up through 2016. About 250,000 water wells have been installed throughout the state. The map's a density map, so every dot is kind of density of wells per square mile. Yellow and warm colors are many wells per square mile. Going down to the cooler colors is fewer, but you can see that the development hasn't been exactly uniform across the state. So there's some areas of heavy development. There's some areas where development is concentrated in drier places, and that leads to kind of unequal impacts in places. Of those 250,000 wells, this set of graphs just gives a general idea of the proportions of those wells and what they're used for. So I can see on this screen, it's a little hard to see. The blue bars here are the percent of water well type. And we can really just focus on the first three. So the first set of bars is for domestic wells, which are exempt from permitting. The second set of bars is for irrigation wells that require water right permits. The third set is for community. That includes municipal, quasi-municipal, mostly require permits as well. And so you can see from the blue bars, almost 90% of the water wells installed in the state are for domestic purposes, and significantly fewer for irrigation and community. The red bars are the percent of total use by those types. So while these domestic wells that don't require a permit are the dominant number of wells, as a percent of total use, it's less than 5% estimated throughout the state, whereas irrigation wells account for about 80+%, community wells another 10%. So just to give some idea of the number of wells we're talking about, the amount of total use we're talking about. And I'll take this to say that this rulemaking looks only at the criteria for future permits. So none of these 250,000+ wells are going to be affected by the rulemaking, nor are the domestic and other types of wells like livestock and other exemptions that don't require a permit to pump those relatively small amounts of water. So need for rulemaking. So as we've developed somewhat more densely in places or developed in areas where the aquifer doesn't have as much capacity as in other places, we can see impacts of what we term over allocation. So we've issued a number of water rights that kind of exceeds the capacity of the system. That can lead to drying up of wells, or at least increased pumping costs where we have water levels falling. It'll take more energy and power to pump that water up. And also can lead to reduced stream flow, as we saw in those introductory slides. Both those things can lead to curtailment of existing rights that people have invested in, and they can also affect water quality in many places in the state. And we see signs of overallocation statewide. So I'm going to show a series of 4 plots here that are going to show Oregon with a bunch of information. These spots show where we have a water level record that shows that spring high water levels have declined more than 50 feet from the highest known. That meets a threshold in rule for a term of excessively declined water levels. You can see they're clustered in some places, but we have instances statewide. It exists throughout the state. Similarly, this plot shows location of where the department has received a report of a dry well, usually domestic wells. We have had this voluntary reporting option available since June of 2021. So these are just dry well reports since 2021. And in areas where there's a darker dot over the top of the red box here, that's a location where a state-supported program has provided cost support to deepen or otherwise repair dry wells. Looking a little further down the groundwater flow path to where it exits to support stream flow, this is a plot of surface water availability in the month of August from our water availability reporting system. And all the tan area there shows where watersheds have been fully allocated from a surface water standpoint. So again, as groundwater is supporting stream flow, especially in August in areas, these are areas where essentially that groundwater has come up to the surface water and it's been fully allocated to existing users. And lastly, this is a plot showing the earliest date of regulation for a stream within each administrative basin throughout Oregon. And again, many streams in the eastern and southern portion have been over allocated since the 1800s. So the water master already curtails back existing, surface water users back to the 1800s in the northwest and coastal parts of the state to about the 1950s or 60s. So again, many streams already not supporting existing users, and many of those streams are receiving groundwater discharge to support that flow, especially late in the summer. So with that, we'll talk about the actual rulemaking. This rulemaking project really started probably back in December of 21 in a discussion with our commission. And at that time, we set out an objective for how we were going to approach this rulemaking. And our objective was to look at updating the groundwater allocation rules to be more sustainable and protective of existing water right holders, both in stream and out of stream. And when we started to look at the rules that we would address, we first started with our statutory authority, which has what we colloquially a 4-part test for whether water is available for additional allocation. And we've focused this rulemaking really on rules that address only one of those 4 parts, and that is whether or not water is available. So under the current rules, water is available if the requested source is not overallocated. So essentially what our current rules say is if it's not overallocated, we'll keep issuing new groundwater rights up until it is overallocated. And then we're likely to see some of those negative impacts that we just went over. And so we are going to stop issuing new rights for additional use. At the same time, we have to address the negative impacts that have occurred from the overallocation. And so looking a little deeper into the rules, over allocated means that we're going to allocate up to the full annual recharge volume. So again, if you think about that hydrologic cycle we started with, the full annual recharge volume is everything that comes in at the top of the system. And so theoretically, the rules have us issuing water rights for all of that. And that means that that flow path is diverted before it comes out on the stream. And that's a older part of the rules. In the mid-90s, we have another set of rules that says, okay, well, let's avoid short-term and acute impacts to surface water, but the rules still allow impacts that build over more than a year to accrue. And we look at just these single allocations. And so we can continue to add additional cumulative impacts, even though they're relatively small. We can issue a lot of relatively small impacts. So in the proposed rules, what we've tried to do is take a different view of whether how to define water as rules us saying that water is available if or only if trends are reasonably stable, if hydraulically connected surface water is available for further appropriation, and if the aquifer is physically capable of producing the requested rate on a new application. And so I'm going to focus again on these two highlighted terms later in the presentation. So before we get there, I just want to go over the kind of course of over time. So first of all, again, this all really began with a discussion with the commission back in December of 2021. We started engaging the Groundwater Advisory Committee at their next meeting after that, starting in March 22, and have talked to them about this every meeting since. We took a tour around the state, including here in Bend over at the OSU Cascades, and took out what people thought of our initial concepts before we tried to do anything. I'll switch here. All right, we'll see if this works better. So before we made any drafting of rules, we took the concepts around the state and gathered input. Then we put together our kind of draft, brought together a rack, and we had 8 meetings with the Rules Advisory Committee since April of 23, including a couple technical information sessions at the rack's request. And we've had a number of additional outreach meetings as requested as well. And the rules, as they're posted in public comment, really benefited from a lot of good input from the rack. And we had input from a number of folks. The rack was 30 people. They represented a pretty diverse group of water interests across the state. And really want to thank the folks that served on the rack and the groups that allowed them to do that for their valuable input. So I'm going to come back to those 2 key issues that the proposed rules changes in order to, again, describe what we did and why. So first of all, this issue number 1 is defining reasonably stable water levels. So reasonably stable water levels is a term that's used in legislative policy. It says reasonably stable water levels shall be determined and maintained. And that was the policy of the 1955 legislature with the Groundwater Act of 55. And that term has never been defined in rule. And therefore, it's really difficult to implement that statutory policy because we don't have any specifics on what that means. And so with this rulemaking effort, we set out to define that. So first of all, we needed to figure out conceptually what reasonably stable meant. This is a graph of several potential hydrographs that might exist. And on the blue line near the top, and water levels just naturally are going to rise and fall over time. They're going to do so in response to a number of different stressors and on different time scales. So the tight squiggle is is representing a seasonal fluctuation. So groundwater levels are naturally going to be at their highest after the wet season, after max. And then especially in areas where pumping is taking place. Keep going, it's gonna go.
Switch back.
Switch. Oh, hey. Okay. We'll do musical mics. Okay. Yeah, sounds good. So, this blue line is representing a lot of natural phenomena. So annual fluctuations. Also, you can see that the peaks are going up and down. So the peak spring highs in Oregon certainly respond to climate cycles. So we have a roughly 10-year wet, dry climate cycle historically in Oregon, and we can commonly see groundwater levels respond to that, as well as to El Nino, La Nina fluctuations. And so reasonably stable isn't a value that exists throughout time. It's a range of values, but in general, that spring high should come back to about where it has been historically. And in this picture, that's called the dynamically stable range. And it's contrasted with, for example, managed aquifer depletion, where other states like Kansas, for example, have just said, we're going to pump our aquifers until they're dry. And that's not statutorily supported in Oregon. So we're looking at dynamically stable range. We want to put together a rule definition that gives us some quantitative values for what that means, so that when we're looking at case-by-case applications, we can apply the same criteria throughout. And so we took a look at our historic data sets. So we had more than 9,000 wells across the state. We took a subset of those that had a relatively long record, so 25 years or more, and that gives us a long enough time period to respond to these decadal climate cycles. And we looked for wells that were dominantly impacted by climate. And we did a statistical analysis of those and found that more than 90% of wells statewide had a decline rate or a falling limb rate of about half a year or less when we average over a 5 to 20 year period. And this decadal rise and fall has a total decline, again, for more than 90% of wells throughout the state of 25 feet or less. And when we took a look at where the other 10% were, they were evenly dispersed throughout the state. So the sensitivity analysis showed that we didn't have, one area that was deviating from this. There were individual wells scattered here and there. So we are pretty confident this is a good representation or a good limit to apply to each case-by-case assessment. And so to sum up what the rules say, again, reasonably stable groundwater levels, we're proposing a definition to define that as decline no more than half a foot a year or 25 feet total from the highest known water level. And the rules go on to set kind of a minimum set of data that we need in order to make that assessment. So we need data from the aquifer that's being applied, that a water right is being applied from. We need at least 5 years of data to assess these trends. And the final data point needs to be within the last 5 years. So we have to have something relatively recent to compare to. And as we brought a form of this definition to the RAC and we're discussing it, some other cases came up that we've built in considerations for. So there are cases where there's artificial recharge, aquifer storage and recovery, where water levels can come up due to human activity. If we have a long-term observation well that's near a reservoir site, like down near Lake Billy Chinook, when that reservoir filled. And so we wanted to get a new battery. A new battery. Uh-oh.
Give it a little power.
Okay. Taps work. All right. So we wanted to account for that, right? We didn't want to have somebody with a, some reasonably stable water level that then rises because of some human caused activity outside. So we made a clause for that. We also have in there the ability to assume reasonably stable if there's no prior groundwater development in an area. So if we get an application for an area where there's been no pumping, then we have the ability to assume that that is in equilibrium with the climate cycle and start from there. And we have kind of reaffirmed our basin proposals for each of the administrative basins can redefine reasonably stable if local group decides that that's something that they would like to assess, with the caveat that that local definition and the rulemaking process that goes with it should assess impacts to existing wells, should assess impacts to ecosystems that are dependent on groundwater, and that it should assess the long-term stability. Okay, so just as an example of how the proposed rules might be applied, this is a hydrograph from the Harney Basin, where we're currently seeing the results of over-allocation, and we are right now going through a critical groundwater area designation rulemaking to have to curtail off junior users to address this pretty drastic water level decline. So in this hydrograph, you can see that water levels kind of showed this reasonably stable up and down trend around some dynamically stable range, and then development in the 90s kind of pushed the system over the edge and water levels began to fall, and water levels continue to fall pretty significantly to today. We stopped issuing water rights in 2013. That was about the time that the declined water levels definition was tripped. Rules, we would have stopped. Transition is the definition of reasonably stable water levels would have been tripped. And while that probably particular would have still led to some over appropriation and some it's kind of an interesting situation. Okay, so essentially, we would have stopped quite a bit earlier in about 2007. And again, we might have still needed to come into this area and do corrective control, but we issued about 2,500 acres worth of irrigation in those intervening years. And so there would be a lot less existing development that we have to go back and then roll back, which is painful for everybody involved. That's something we absolutely want to avoid. Yes.
Standing mics, thank you.
Ah, okay.
It is, I've been watching closed captions, so it is picking up. You're speaking loud enough, at least it's getting that. Something less frustrating.
Also, it's a little funny in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might want to pin me down, Karen.
All right, let's try that. All right, sorry.
No worries. Okay. Let's see. All right, how's that work? Okay, excellent. All right, so I'm gonna keep moving along here, and we will go to the next item. Okay, so wrapping up this key issue number one, again, want to talk about some of the impacts of not maintaining reasonably stable water levels. So we've already talked about, all right, I showed a map of the dry well complaints we've received since July of 21. So over 1,200 dry well complaints statewide. That's a voluntary reporting. So that's a minimum number of dry wells that are out there. From our financial support programs, the rough average cost to deepen a dry well has been about $26,000. And there has been more than $9 million in public investments over the last few years that has been completely allocated to folks that have deepened their wells. And there's ongoing demand. So if you remember back to that plot I showed you of dry wells and the dark blue circles over the top where we've provided funding, there's a lot more red squares with dry wells than there are areas we've been able to plug in this public investment. And just as a very back of the envelope risk assessment, we took a look at all water wells in the state. So all roughly 250,000 wells that were shown on one of the first plots I showed you. We looked at all those well logs. We assessed the total well depth. We looked at the water level above total well depth and found that roughly 15,000 wells would be at risk of going dry given a water level decline of 25 feet. So even with these reasonably stable standards, there's a number of wells out there that haven't been drilled very low below the water table that are at risk of going dry. And given a 50-foot drop, up to 55,000 wells would be at risk of going dry. So I want to be sure that I say that we aren't expecting water levels to drop statewide 25 feet or 50 feet. This is to get an idea of the number of water wells out there that are drilled 25 feet or 50 feet below the static water table. Okay, so with that, I want to move on to this key issue number 2, and redefining this term of art, potential for substantial interference with surface water. So want to note, especially for this group, this potential for substantial interference, or PSI, as I'm probably going to say, is something that is addressed by the Deschutes groundwater to surface water mitigation program that was put in place, I believe, in the 1990s. So for this particular basin, this part of the rule isn't as applicable, but want to make sure that I go over it because I know there's some folks from outside the Deschutes basin here, and it's just an important part of the rule statewide. Okay, so I want to do this, and I generally do this with an anecdote. So if you were here at the information sessions, you've already heard me say that this is Eagle Creek. This is a place that I like to go to every summer, a couple times a summer. And when it's hot and dry in the valley, hasn't rained appreciably for a couple months, I can drive up into the hills and Eagle Creek is always flowing. It's not that high of elevation. There's no snowpack in the uplands of Eagle Creek. It's in a wilderness area. There's no dams. So this flow that I can rely on being there, and others rely on, a fish hatchery downstream, irrigators downstream below that, that is essentially all groundwater. That's water that's landed in that watershed, infiltrated deeply, flowed to the lowest point, and is coming out as stream flow. And that Eagle Creek drainage, that watershed, is fully appropriated 5 months of the year. So there's no more, or I should say, the flow in that stream has already been fully allocated to existing users. And I should really say it's over allocated. So the water master regulates users on Eagle Creek, she says, roughly 3 out of every 4 years. And yet under the current rules, we've continued to issue groundwater rights in the Eagle Creek drainage that, again, if you think back to the very top of the presentation, those groundwater extractions are going to capture water along a flow path that's coming out to support the stream flow that we see here. And so what we propose with the rules that are up for a public comment is that instead of saying, well, if the groundwater impact is going to accrue over a relatively long period of time, years to decades, or if we say, a groundwater user can take 1% of that flow, but we can issue 10 or 20 or 100 rights that take 1% of that flow. Instead of those current standards that are in the present rule, we're proposing instead in hydraulically connected systems, so systems where groundwater is tributary to surface water, we are proposing that we look at the surface water body, the tributary surface water body, and ask, is there water available for further allocation? Is it being regulated regularly? Is it already withdrawn in rule? Or is there an in-stream water right that's not being met? So are there existing users, senior users in our prior appropriation system that aren't being met, that depend on that groundwater discharge to that surface water body? So groundwater contributes to flow in many, but not all parts of the state. So this is an example from the Sprague River down in the northern Klamath Basin, where we understand that groundwater pumping directly affects surface water flows. I want to be clear that that surface water in the Sprague does have snowmelt. There's other flow, but groundwater is a contributor to it. And in this system, since 2014, all all surface water rights essentially have been curtailed down to the last senior right on that stream. And while that occurs, groundwater pumping still exists. And I want to be clear that this rulemaking isn't going to address that particular issue, but it will stop making that type of issue worse statewide. So again, want to be clear, these are future-looking rules to new water rights. They aren't going to affect the existing users there, but it will help in this case and other cases statewide of continuing to nick away at those flows. So to summarize the rule language, again, we're first going to make a hydraulic connection assessment to say, is this aquifer that's the source of an application for a new water right, is it hydraulically connected to surface water? We're going to do that in the future the same way we do it today. So we already make this assessment. And we're going to make that assessment over the proposed period of use. And that's going to be variable for different types of applications. And then we're going to say if that hydraulic connection exists, then there is the potential for substantial interference. And we're going to then say, well, is it substantial interference? And we're going to look at the surface water source. Then we're going to look at the tributary surface water source and ask, is it already over appropriated? Is it withdrawn or restrictively classified? Is it regulated off to satisfy senior rights? And does it have unmet in-stream water rights? And if so, then that tributary groundwater will be considered to have substantial interference with surface water, and we would make a water is unavailable finding under these proposed rules. So the implications of that is that we're going to, again, do a case-by-case evaluation of every permit. And in Oregon, many, but not all, will be likely to be found to have hydraulic connection. And so for hydraulically connected aquifers, availability, again, is going to rely on the health of that surface water system. And if promulgated, we would expect that we will issue, or we will make less findings that groundwater is available than we do now. And that means that we're going to need to think about meeting our future needs in other ways than a new right to pump additional groundwater. And so there's a number of existing options we have. Conservation, subsurface storage, water reuse, and transfers are all existing programs. And there's the potential for a number of future opportunities. So again, want to acknowledge in this basin, in the Deschutes Basin, there's already a mitigation program that might be an impetus to build that out in other basins. We've heard through our place-based planning efforts the desire to explore market-based approaches, and there's other ideas that have come out of the basin and regional planning that we've heard. So those are all potential or future opportunities. The benefits, as we see them to the proposed rules, are that we're going to increase certainty for existing users. So again, existing users are already in many places struggling to have their needs met. And by not adding junior users to the system, will increase their certainty in the future. We expect to see fewer dry wells, lower pumping costs, preserved water quality. But I think most importantly to consider is that the new rules, I believe, are more consistent with the prior appropriation doctrine that undergirds our whole water rights system. And we're going to, in the long run, reduce future conflict over a limited supply of water. So with that, this is the first of multiple public hearings we're going to hold around the state. So we're planning to answer any questions folks might have for the next 20 minutes or so. Then we're going to take a break. We'll come back for the public hearing. And the public hearing is the point in time where folks can provide their comments on the rules into the record. Written comments, if you want to take your time and think it out and write it down, are accepted through the end of May. I'll put up the website and the email address here where you can send that soon. And we will be evaluating those comments through June and July. And our plan is to bring a final rule recommendation to the commission in September. So with that, there is the website with all this information and more. And there you'll find also the place to submit your written public comments. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Also on the FAQ sheet that you can pick up outside too, so you don't have to write it all down.
So if you didn't hear that, the website is also on a frequently asked questions sheet that's available at the door. So
Hold on, let me get you the mic.
Thank you. I have a question on transfers. When you're transferring the right to drill for water, obtain water from one geographic area to another. For example, in the Sisters Bend area, there's a really significant fault system that runs from Black Butte down to area. And in that fault zone, there's a tremendous drop in where the water is. On the west side of Bend, you can find a water table in a couple 100 feet. If you get over towards Redmond, I'm thinking of Thornburg in particular, it's much lower than that. We're talking thousands of feet. And I don't understand why anyone would contemplate taking a water right that existed on the west side of Bend and transferring it to a much deeper aquifer and consider that prudent.
Okay. So I'm going to say thank you for your question. I want to emphasize, for the purposes of the rulemaking that we're here tonight for, these rules don't affect anything related to transfers. So want to make that clear to the audience. Your question is noted, and I'm also going to punt on that because I'll be talking about that in court at the end of the month, and I don't think it's prudent for me to get into it right here. So yeah.
Yes, so if these water levels are not currently stable, reasonably stable, they're dropping, these rules will not prevent that from continuing. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So if water levels are currently falling and they've fallen more, well, the rate of decline is likely to be the same because that rate of decline is happening with the pumping that's occurring today. And these rules are going to not make that problem worse by saying if the threshold for reasonably stable water levels has been met, then water isn't available for further allocation. So I guess I'll even just go back to this hydrograph because I have it here. These water level declines, sorry, trying to get a pointer up here. They started out relatively shallow, and with more and more allocation, they got steeper and steeper. So in this example, the water level declines wouldn't have gotten as steep had these rules been in place earlier. So it's a more of a don't make it worse than it is a we're going to address anything that might be going on today.
So these rules really don't address the 1955 rules that say that it needs to be reasonably stable in in situations.
Yeah, I mean,
that are already bad.
that's right. It addresses it going forward, but it doesn't apply to any rights that exist today.
So I guess my main question is, are you planning in the future to address that, since that's part of the rules that aren't being enforced now?
I think that would be a great comment for you to put. So. Doug?
Hey, Justin, thank you. So I will note that this is from the Harney Basin. which
That's correct.
has dramatically different hydrology, saturation, depth, et cetera,
Sure.
compared to the Deschutes Basin, right? So is the department saying that groundwater pumping is causing all of the well declines in the Deschutes Basin?
No. So in the Deschutes Basin is one of the places where we're fortunate to have already conducted what we call a cooperative groundwater basin study. So that's a multi-year investigation that the department enters into with the USGS often. And through that study, there was an assessment of some of the water level declines that had occurred over a 10-year period. I'm going to crib here. That 10 years was... Okay, so from 94 to 2008, any water level declines in that 14-year period were assessed and partitioned out to several causes, and those were in order of impact: a drying climate in the Cascades, 65%, pumping, 25-ish%, canal lining, 10-ish%, and I hope that all added up to roughly 100, but that's it in order. The magnitude is climate drying, pumping, canal lining.
As a follow-up, but the tool that the department is proposing under these rules is simply to cut off groundwater pumping permits. Is that correct? The only tool that's allowable under the rules.
Yeah, I want to make clear that yes, the rulemaking addresses new permits. So when you say cutting off, I want to make sure that that's separated, not existing rights, but the issuing of additional rights to add to the groundwater declines that we're seeing in some parts of the basin.
But the presentation seems to be suggesting that if under this chart and scenario, if you cut off future permits, you will stop the decline of all groundwater well declines and see recoveries in groundwater readings. Is that correct?
No, I don't. I'm not saying that we would see recoveries here. This was a hypothetical to show how the rules would be applied to a actual hydrograph. And essentially what I am saying is, if in this case, which as you point out is different than the Deschutes case, we had stopped issuing in 2007 and pulled up about 2,500 irrigated acres short, I would expect that the trend would be flatter and there would be less overall declines than there is today. And I would expect the same to be true in the future if there was an application in an area that we're already seeing declines in this basin. Adding more pumping to that, I believe, will exacerbate those declines. But I'm not saying it will turn them around or flatten them out. So not add to, that's the operative point.
Other questions?
Hey, Justin, quick answer or quick response to the first question. Mike Bender, Utilities Director here for the City of Bend. So if, in terms of transfers, we would never transfer a water right from the west side of Bend to a different city or a different jurisdiction. That's not allowed. We could transfer water rights within our own water service area. And that's pretty common practice for utilities that have multiple groundwater wells that feed different parts of their system. And so as your water distribution system changes over time, you're going to want to look at your groundwater wells and where you have your water rights associated, and you may want to make changes over time. So the City of Bend will absolutely look at where those water rights are assigned and the well facilities and really the growth patterns of our system, but we would never be able to transfer one of those rights to Redmond, or sisters would not be able to transfer rights to Bend. Or I just wanted to make that clarification. Okay. Justin, I did have a question for you related to the exempt unregulated wells and some of the numbers, the hypothetical numbers you put out there in terms of the numbers that could go dry at a 25-foot drop or a 50-foot drop. Is the department considering any sort of requirements for well drilling depths? Because part of the problem with those wells, and we've looked at them as well, there was a period of time where drilling in, 25 or 50 feet into an aquifer was good enough and done. And I think, those days are past us. Now people realize that from a resiliency standpoint, you need to go further than that. Is the department looking at any sort of regulatory guidelines around well depths? And when you go back and re-drill one of these wells, how much further are you going into the ground?
Okay, that is a good question. I'm going to try and answer it as quickly as I can. So to directly answer your question, right now we don't have any rulemaking or discussion underway of some minimum depth below the water table. And I also want to say that we do currently have criteria for seasonal interference. So if you don't even have to, I can just come back here. So this seasonal up and down, there are places in the state, Willamette Valley, I'm thinking of, where the summer low has gotten lower and lower and lower, but there's a good deal of precipitation and the water levels generally come back up to this within this dynamically stable range. We do currently have rules that say if your well goes dry due to something down here due to pumping, that you need to have your well fully penetrate the aquifer is the terminology in the rule. So we do have some consideration of that. These rules are really looking at these spring highs and does the water level come back to approximately where it was? So are water levels recovering every year such that we have a similar starting point at the beginning of every dry season? So I hope that was clear and not muddled, but it's nuanced. Yeah.
Last two.
Evening. So this concept of reasonably stable groundwater levels is connected to a historic benchmark level. Could you talk a little bit more about how you set those levels or how you determine those benchmarks? You've got historic data, you've got, you have a lot of things you need to think about and look at, but what does that process look like for kind of picking that benchmark?
Right. Okay. So I'll start by saying that we're always evaluating these applications on a case-by-case basis. We're looking at the best available data we have in the vicinity of the application. And to some degree, we are limited by what data we have. The rules right now, I believe the language says spring high water level. So that would be the water level for that aquifer system in the vicinity of the application that we have a record to set. Now, if there's an application for a property and there's an adjacent or nearby property for which we have data from a well in the same aquifer, we'll use that local data. Otherwise, we might need to set that based on, if we have a relatively short new record, the highest known spring high is going to be based, on that information that we have. So, yep.
Your question to say, what analysis did you do to choose 25 feet and a half a foot, 0.6 foot per year? How did we choose what the criteria are in the rule? Did I misunderstand?
No, just answering the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wanna make sure we're answering the question.
Yeah.
So your question is about what analysis will we do at the time of receiving an application to determine whether or not their reasonably stable water levels exist or not?
Yeah, I mean, I want to know
Okay.
how you determine that benchmark. And I guess one of the things I particularly want to understand is, here at the Deschutes Basin, do you have a lot of data points across the landscape from which to benchmark?
We have a number of, I will say, longer term obs wells. I think we have more than a handful that go back to the 60s, and I'm going to look at Joe to see if if some that go prior to that. Okay, so Joe said we've got a couple of wells that go back to the 1940s. Obviously, groundwater systems have been perturbed before that, but that's where our water level data set extends to.
Sorry, I wanted to make sure. What?
Just a quick procedural question. Through what go through these hearings and you have some proposed or you want to do some wordsmithing, are we going to be able to see that final rule before the commission adopts it? Are we going to have some time to review it and digest it?
I'm going to answer that. So
I turned it off.
thank you. So we will be accepting comments in May. We will make a determination on next steps once we see the full universe of the comments. And depending on what kind of changes we think about making in comments, at that time we'll determine whether or not we do additional public involvement before it goes to the commission. Otherwise, it would be available as soon as it goes to the commission and is on their agenda, it'd be available for others to look at. All right, so with that, we are going to wrap up the informational session and we will start the hearing promptly at 7 o'clock. And again, if you would like to testify or submit oral comments tonight, please sign up out front. You can submit written comments until the end of May, and there will be 3 additional opportunities to also submit oral comments. So thank you again for coming.